The show is The Other Future. I am your host, Terry Tapp, and my guest this morning is Jason Patrick Voegele. If you've just tuned in for the first time, you'll know in this show, what I try and do is find people who represent something other than the future where we seem to be moving toward, given the media spectacle, especially after the election of our current resident in the White House. A lot of people experience despair, and we're looking for something to grasp onto that is a lot more positive. So my guest today, I try and pick people from the arts, sciences, activism, philosophy, politics. Jason kind of, to me, combines a lot of those. I met him at the Lodge Gallery, which he curated and owned, managed, in the Lower East Side Chinatown border. And the Lodge was amazing. I had a lot of really challenging, exciting shows. And I got talking with Jason and found out some of his background and what he's into and his projects, and was really amazed by him. So without further ado, Jason, are you there?
Hey, Terry, how you doing?
Hey, how are you?
Good morning.
I should introduce you, I guess, primarily as a curator right now, writer, artist, creative entrepreneur. But can you tell us about what you're doing currently?
The Lodge Gallery closed about a year and a half ago, and since then I've been mostly working with private clients and artists to help them sort of reconceptualize their careers. Get them in the mindset of creative entrepreneurs rather than sort of passively embracing the art world and letting it take them along for a ride.
Right.
So I've been mostly focused on that, but I've also been doing quite a bit of traveling. So after the 6 years of the Lodge Gallery of 6 days a week, 16 hours a day, it's been kind of nice to get back out there and mingle with the people again.
Yeah, of course. And so what, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, you do so much traveling. And come from, originally you're born in Hong Kong, correct?
Well, actually I was born in Jerome, Idaho, and I left there when I was about 2 years old, but I grew up in Hong Kong, and I went to high school in Taiwan. I moved from Taiwan to New York in 91 to go to college at Pratt Institute, but yeah, most of my early life anyways, was spent traveling quite a bit. My father traveled a lot too, so my brother and I would end up traveling along with him. So I got to see a lot of Southeast Asia and a lot of the world before I even got to college.
Right. And that gives you a unique perspective, or not unique, but very rare perspective of having immersed yourself in other cultures and now being, back in the U.S., which I guess we call your maybe your primary culture, or or culture of origin. When you you introduced a term to me that I hadn't heard before, which is third culture.
Oh yeah,
kids.
We were talking about that the other day. Third culture kid. Yeah, it's sort of a it's common these days. People travel around so much, and the world is so globalized and interconnected. But in the 70s and 80s, it was a far rarer experience. Third culture kids are people who, for example, my parents are American, but I didn't grow up in America. I grew up in Taiwan and Hong Kong, but I'm not Taiwanese or Chinese, and so you'd call me a third culture kid. And there's a huge network of people out there who grew up in international schools all over the world who for a long time felt kind of alone, but with the dawn of the Internet have been able to reconnect. If you Google third culture kids, you could probably find out more information about that.
I did Google that, and I was fascinated by it because one of the subjects that we talked about, and it's very pertinent to this show, which we could flesh out more, is this kind of, I guess you put it, psychic nomadism. We're not really in a place anymore, and you actually don't have a physical gallery anymore, so we're kind of floating above geography in a sense.
Well, you would use the analogy of something to do with the Sioux Indians. There was a quote that you told me that really hit home.
Yeah, the Sioux, at least the Western Sioux, the Lakota, had I don't know how to say it, but as a paraphrase, they said that the Sioux Nation was carried by each person, each warrior, I guess, but each individual, once the the cavalry, the U.S. cavalry, had obliterated their homeland as its original parameters. They carried that nation with them. And so I kind of look at us doing that now. I mean, if I can kind of skip ahead, one thing we talked about that I want to get into in this program, you know, if you went to Paris in 1880, for instance, or 1870, you're surrounded by artists. You're surrounded by a challenge to the gallery system with the salons, you know, the alternative salons, a kind of union of scientists which are nearby, studying physics and optics and such, and philosophy too, with the work of the artists, the impressionist and the expressionist and so forth. That's fascinating. You could go to New York City in the 70s, and partly in the 50s, but definitely in the 70s into the 80s in Lower Manhattan, and you find something very similar where you got that kind of really intense cross-fertilization and a real community. And, you know, I lived in New York City for almost a decade. I'm originally from Kentucky. And now I'm mainly living in the Catskills and going back and forth to the city. But I'm not really connected to any place. And New York City, to me, has flattened into this almost a reflection of strip mall culture, which saddens me to say.
The whole world is devolving into that, I feel like.
Yeah, and you have an interesting perspective on that because, you know, I've traveled a little. I'm growing up in Kentucky, not to focus this solely on me, but I'm sure many other people have this experience. Growing up in Kentucky, there was almost no way out. If you could go to an airport, and there were none near me for many years, you would have to spend an exorbitant amount of money to get away from Kentucky and just to get somewhere else in the U.S. And being in New York City, you know, a plane flight to Europe is $400 round trip on the right airline.
Yeah.
But you've gone everywhere. And so you bring this, you know, an observation that I don't have. I haven't lived in Taiwan or Hong Kong. I haven't traveled even through, you know, northern Canada, for instance. So what are you seeing? Like, just your response to that about the flattening?
Well, first of all that traveling that I did, you know, for a long time in my life, I took a lot of that for granted because it was just sort of the natural part of my upbringing. My parents dragged me around everywhere, so it just seemed pretty normal. But speaking to what you're talking about with New York and Paris, it's interesting to me because both of those movements were really grounded in the place itself, and either building a history for the place or celebrating the history of the place. But I feel like now, especially with the internet and the way that people are able to communicate so freely wherever they are in the world, maybe the future of those kinds of movements aren't grounded in any place at all. And like we're talking about, they're grounded in the individuals who reach out and connect with people all over the world. So maybe the Earth now is the place for us all to gather and rally around and network to build the future, you know?
Yeah, I like that idea on one hand. And on the other hand, I'm hesitant.
Well, I try to stay positive about it all.
Yeah, of course. I'm not trying to be positive or negative either. I'm just trying to encompass, like, to say the negative first before I respond with any more exciting way. It reminds me, you know, of other kinds of cyber activities where it's really a letdown in the sense that, I mean, if you have a community where you can walk down the street to a gallery or two, you're hearing a talk, you're hanging out in a bar or a coffee shop and you're meeting people, you know, that's such a bonding experience, and in terms of the cross-fertilization of ideas, it's wonderful because you get, you know, that kind of off the air or offline or off the record experience with someone that's hard to obtain. And if you're looking at it online, like our sense of community, if you're typing into a keyboard or on your phone with someone, you know, in Java or someone in Malaysia, that seems like a very pale reflection. You know.
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing that's a substitute for that tangible human experience, right?
Right. On the positive, though, I mean, this kind of inquiry began, at least with you and me, originally, which we're picking up now, with this idea of what would you do as an artist? Where would you go? And I asked this to Seth Tabachman, who's an amazing artist, has lived in New York City most of his life. And he said at 18 it was Lower Manhattan. And now I have no idea. Nor do the 18-year-olds that I have tattooed. No,
I don't think that they do know. I don't think anybody knows. I know that there have been attempts to try and recreate that kind of energy in places like Detroit. There was a big movement about 10 years ago where a lot of artists who were just looking for cheap rent and space to create and build communities and collectives went out to Detroit. They found the space and they built a local community out there. But the problem was there were no collectors or people to buy the artwork or support it or anything like that. So, it didn't have that built-in, network of press or anything like that New York has, for example.
Right.
So I don't know if it ever really took off in that same way.
I've talked to people online, obviously, and in person about Detroit, and the weird thing about it is that not only is that true that you said, but there's some deception going on. I don't think intentional necessarily, but deception about property values and such. You can't just go to Detroit and pick up, a building for $1 like you could, as some squatters did. I think I've forgotten how many hundred Seth Tabachman had mentioned, that acquired property that they were working on and squatting in, 1990 and such. They're not doing that. You have to pay back taxes a lot of the time, and the restoration is very expensive, and it's very complicated.
I believe it, and I'm sure that a lot of people didn't find that out until they got there.
Yeah, in fact, I was reading the accounts of people saying, we don't find that. We didn't understand that there were these complexities. There's this idea about, as we're talking about, I guess, the tribe. As we're looking for a group of a collective of artists and thinkers and people doing things. There's this idea that stirred around at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, that we're moving toward this one global society. And you find this, especially some of my interest in terms of action, with the IWW. You have a one big world union of the working class. And people would go on strike if there was a problem. You could go on strike as a hemisphere, in terms of industry and such. And I could see something like that beginning to come over the horizon in terms of the arts, because now that you have artists that can live in Idaho, or artists that can live in southern Argentina, and not be heard. I remember the experience of being in Kentucky, and really feeling like the rest of the world was an entirely different planet. But you could live in a very isolated place and have a connection because of the internet and because of travel and such. So there is that possibility coming. But, you touched on something that's a frustrating point in that line of thought, which is buying art and supporting yourself as an artist. Can you say more about that? 'Cause you're doing something now that's very, very different from a traditional gallery structure.
Well, it's funny because I work with a lot of artists that are trying to build a new approach to engaging a career on their own as creative entrepreneurs. It's first of all, I should say it's somewhat interesting because a lot of them come from a more traditional artistic background, meaning like figurative representational work rather than conceptual abstract or installation work and stuff like that. But I'll give you an example of one person. Her name is Dena Broadsky, incredibly talented painter and artist, but has managed to figure out how to collect about 250,000 followers on Instagram.
Which is amazing.
She posts videos of herself painting. People from all over the world reach out to her directly all the time, and although she does show with galleries and works with galleries on a pretty regular basis, she's able to sell her work through the galleries, support herself by promoting other people's projects on the internet and through Instagram. It's kind of a fascinating way to sort of bypass the problem of how do I get into a gallery and why do I even want to get into a gallery in a culture or a city that is seemingly on the cultural decline.
Yeah.
It's very progressive, and I think a lot of artists are starting to think that way and sort of take the reins of the business into their own hands instead of passively, just following along.
And I like that quite a bit. My one observation that I have, I was thinking about this morning even, if you could move all of your activities, your communications, your contacts, let's just say in a broader sense, to the internet, that the monitoring and patrol of the internet and corporate control actually seems to be like a shadow across the possibility of a community of reaching out to other artists, because if there's anything challenging, and there should be a lot of things challenging, I mean that really brings a vibrancy to the art.
Well, that's what the history of art is all about, right? Being progressive and challenging social norms, and twisting the zeitgeist around.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't want to do that with a school marm, or especially if she's a school marm, with a Homeland Security badge, watching me. You know what I'm saying? I want to do that. Like if you're in Paris in 1880, you're doing all types of things all night and painting and and you're living this bohemian life. But if someone put a microscope up to it, you're just kind of broke and dirty and obnoxious and self-focused. It's better to read about it. But as a community, that's fascinating if you have a bunch of those people doing interesting things together. I wouldn't want, the school marm, whether it's little brother in the corporate sense or big brother in a state sense. I guess those are the same thing anymore. But I wouldn't want someone looking at me disheveled, staying up all night working and monitoring my conversations and such. But that to me is one of the barriers that we could face with looking at the potential global artistic and activist, scientific, philosophical community, that whatever we're going to call that, the tribe.
Well, I think that's actually going on right now. I know a number of artists who are taking that approach that Dena Broadsky is doing, as I mentioned, engaging the world directly through the internet. But, if you post a picture of a nude painting on Facebook, you get banned and blocked for several days.
Yeah, and Instagram too.
And then that affects your ability to promote yourself more through the internet. So, there's inherent problems, of course, in this approach, but it's in the early days of it all. So, it could all collapse, or maybe those barriers will be lifted eventually.
Yeah, and I agree, but being lifted still implies that there's a lifter, rather than a free flowing. I have many 10,000 projects in my sketchbook that I try and work on. One of them is an exhibit of inherently illegal constructions, which is all I'll say on air. It wouldn't be illegal as they are realized, but I realize it could be controversial. And I thought, it's so weird to do research on these and to promote it. Like, I would immediately run up against all types of security and surveillance issues. And we really need some sort of way of communicating with each other and showing our art and exchanging that is outside of that kind of control. I don't know what that is now. I've seen people talk about, an alternate to Facebook or an alternate to Instagram or something in there. But
well, there's all those, secret Reddit, like group chat clubs and things like that, where you can find out about like QAnon and all the crazy political, ideas and stuff out there. One of the interesting things is another sort of downside of social networking is that if you think you can go ahead and just make one post about anything political at all, or anything about, anything really, all that information is being collected and your name is getting dropped into databases here and there and on this registry and that registry, and you have no idea who is following along with you and what lists you're on. I imagine in 2020 a lot of people are going to find out which lists they're on when they start to get direct marketed from Facebook and Instagram.
Yes. And it's so over the top. I told people this story, and it sounds ridiculous, but my mother and father live outside of Owensboro, Kentucky, and it's basically on an edge of a rural area. And it's a bigger town, city in Kentucky now, but it's basically a small town that expanded. They're retired. There's nothing of any interest in them that anyone in any sort of security field, anything would have. And my mother was speaking with a neighbor, talking about putting some shelving up, and mentioned drilling holes, putting a headboard of this piece up on the wall, trivial conversation. She got a knock from the sheriff's department on her door, and they asked her if everything was okay because they heard that someone was going to drill holes in her head.
That's crazy.
It's bizarre because there's absolutely no need to monitor her conversation. And not only monitor, but that means that conversation had been taken from a stream of data that I'm guessing, from what information I've collected, a computer system is monitoring. And then... Oh, yeah, some AI algorithm is out there, like, searching for specific words, right? Exactly. And then that gets taken up levels or down levels, whatever, prepositional metaphor we want, to someone who actually is listening to it, to someone who's reporting a need to go and investigate that. So if you're using more directly illegal or threatening or potentially terroristic words, and we all use them, but if you're using those, what kind of monitoring is going on with those? That's well, it's funny. It reminds me of the fear of Big Brother kind of thing. But maybe Big Brother isn't a Big Brother. Maybe it's just sort of some abstract algorithm out there on the internet that's going to control all of us. It is, and I think it's both. If you want some information on what Jason's doing, let me give you a place you can go and look at that. NewYorkArtConsultant.com. That is NYART Consultant.com. I want to back up to something you were talking about, because the Lodge did such challenging art, and I always made time to come to the exhibits if I could make time, and just to see what was going on there. You mentioned New York City and cultural decline, and that's paired against this other movement, in Paris, in London, in Hong Kong. That seems to be flattening the world. And at the same time, you have the artist, if you want to keep up with these metaphors, scattering from these concentrated zones of creativity and inquiry. Say more about that. You've lived in New York City since, you said, 91, correct? Yeah, it's almost 30 years now. Talk about the changes you've seen in that, because I'm still looking for the root cause of that. I did a podcast, the sound quality was not good, and I didn't keep it online, but with an urban planner, and she was talking about gentrification in New York City, which is one of her specialties of study, and India, which was her other. And it was fascinating to hear the commonalities and the differences between the two. So what's your experience with the city and what's happened? Well, I'm of so many minds about it. One, my initial instinct is always to feel like, when you're there and you're in the moment. Well, let me say this. I wonder if in the 70s in New York City, that mythical, romanticized vision I had of New York before I moved here, I wondered if at the time, the city was was a nightmare in many ways. I'm not sure if the people at the time realized that they were creating, or that they were going to be thought of as this great, renaissance of culture in New York. It's something that happens in retrospect. Right. That people think back on it more romantically than it actually was. I remember when I first moved to Brooklyn, the crack epidemic was horrible. It was all over the place. All of the beautiful mansions that were built by the Tiffany's families and the Pratt families and the Vanderbilt families were all abandoned. I remember I'd be walking home to my tiny little apartment to go to sleep and get up and go to college the next day. And it was a horrible place that I was living in, but I'd see crackheads with their feet dangling out of the top floors of mansions. It was almost like they ran the city back then. Right. But it was scary. I got held up at gunpoint a couple of times, It wasn't the easiest place to live, but over time, that changed. Everything got more beautiful. As it got more beautiful and the grit disappeared, that energy also disappeared too. So, I had expected it to all balance itself out, but now it feels like the return to the beautiful Brooklyn that
that maybe never even existed is like overshadowed any of that like creative energy that was there when it was such a horrible place. It's kind of a strange dichotomy, you know?
Yeah, and I as I walk around the city, I realize like I think of that as a dichotomy, but at the same time, what's being built there is this thing that one of the terms people have used for it is landmark architecture. But there are other terms for it. But it's actually, I researched this a little and saw it all over the world. Those boxy Lego-looking constructions that are being dropped like Galactus and attacking the zone one after another. And so we're not really looking back to this beautiful but very, I guess, creatively deadened type situation, but a weird sort of aesthetically dead area, not just creatively, but it's not fun.
Well, you have to wonder what the intention is there. Then what is what's the function and the purpose of building these things? It's certainly not to create the energy of a creative environment. It's for business purposes, probably. I mean, go look at Hudson Yards. That place was supposed to be this great marriage of the corporate world meets like art, and it's so sterile.
Yeah, it's horrible. I was working at a tattoo shop this past when was that? It was this winter, I guess, not this winter, but last fall, and I had to, because of the changes on the PATH train. And I was going to New Jersey, of course, but changes on the subway, rerouting, and the construction, I had to pass through the Oculus building.
Oh, yeah.
And I really felt like I was in a nightmare. It's all shopping type, corporate chains, and it's in something that looks like the bones of a giant chicken. And, go ahead.
Well, to me, it's just like something that you'd see in Singapore, or that you'd see in Paris, or it's just this strange international fusion of shopping malls where I don't think, you walk through there too and you see all these high-end stores. It's people just passing back and forth from like the PATH train to New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I don't see anybody shopping in those places. I feel like it's the whole intent and purpose of the entire project is to just, show off opulence in some way.
Right.
But there's nobody there that's really interested in much of it.
Yeah, it actually, I had some reflections on that because I ended up about 4 different weekends having to go through there, and it made my hour commute, 45-minute commute into a 3-hour commute. So I was in a bad headspace. But I noticed what you're talking about. People are just moving through these environments. And I was recalling George Romero and the mall scenes with the zombies, and I thought I didn't want to be, just the teenage me with that kind of angst about shopping and zombieism and such. But I thought, one reason that these zombie movies are still motivating people is not that the dead are coming back to life, but that the living are the walking dead in a very straightforward manner, because no one's shopping, and you're going through this giant chicken breast of bones, and it's such a bizarre moment. I actually I started to lose it one time because you can't get out of that place easily, and I started walking around. I was in this long commute, and I couldn't get out. And watching these people that were, to me, somnambulists, strolling through the guts of that chicken and not shopping, but looking at these displays that were themselves so bland and awful. I actually felt this berserker violence coming over me, and I mean,
I don't know if you noticed, but nobody's really talking in there either. They're just kind of silently making their way from one window display to the other as they pass through or ride up the escalator to the Starbucks and the John Varvatos store.
So what do we? I back as a kid in Kentucky, I really hated where I was, and I hated. Kentucky really doesn't, especially rural Kentucky, for the most part, has no architecture. The structures that were built by very poor people, and they collapse, and then more other poor people build others. Or you have trailers, and they rot, and as they rot and rust, they look awful. and it's very depressing. And when I would read comic books, especially, and see the structures in New York City, I was fascinated by this. But the thing that began entering my world in my later teen years in Kentucky was the strip mall. And I was stunned by the strip mall because I found it to be an unbelievable achievement, being that it was more depressing than a rotting trailer or an old barn or a road, a lonely road. They used to call them the high lonesomes, with those mountain roads especially, where there's just no sign of human life or human activity at all, which is refreshing in a way, but also to a teenager very depressing. So, the strip mall and what that is, I think is moving some of the intention behind the architecture and the development, and it's almost as if, not to be this conspiratorial, it's almost as if there's a conspiracy against the imagination that's going on. Because you take some of these beautiful spots, like in Paris or New York City, that have inspired so many people, not just artists, but everyday people. So I hate to make that distinction, so I don't believe in it, but someone who's not creating actively at that moment, it's inspired them to be more idealistic, more compassionate. A beautiful park actually opens people up, and to see these, I feel like it's in a way, whether it's intentional or not, and I wonder if at times if it is, to close people down so that you aren't looking around, you aren't experiencing as deeply, you aren't talking to people as much. What do you think? Oh, man,
I think that's very, very true. It's commerce over culture, and when do people spend the most money is when they're feeling the worst about themselves.
That's an excellent point. When you were talking about commerce versus art, I think there's something deeper in there. And, you had mentioned to me your father's work. I was really intrigued by that because there were insights in there. My own political bent is about as far left as you can get, and I'm still working on that. But so I'm usually I take an anti-capitalist approach at the very beginning, but I'm always intrigued when something pushes complexity into there even further, so I can re-examine my own beliefs. And talking a little bit about what your father did just that. Can you say?
Well, I think we were talking about this idea of people like my father. Spoke many languages and sociologists. He dabbled in a little bit in politics and a little bit in science. So he was one of these guys who it's fairly common today for people to go out there into the world. But in the 70s, early 80s, he and teams would go out into places like Southeast Asia to help sort of redevelop the post-war like countries, helping them develop maybe British parliamentary-style democracies with American economic systems. Yeah. The idea being that, America learned its lesson from Vietnam. You can't fight land wars in Asia, but you can turn all your enemies into consumers of your products.
Right.
It's a very sort of capitalist, new colonialism in a way.
Right.
Where instead of taking over the country, you were going to help them redevelop into advantageous allies, right, sort of thing. But I think I was telling you the stories of when, Kentucky Fried Chicken and companies like that first went out there, and they were importing all of their products to meet the global branding standards. So, you eat a chicken leg in, Mumbai, and it tastes exactly like it does in Ohio or something like that.
Right.
And there was the backlash to that, which was, the companies were making an enormous profit off of the local people in all these, emerging new countries, but they weren't really giving anything back to the economy or to the people.
Right.
And so part of my father's job was to go out there and, help build the formula for American businesses to go over, but then go out into the farmland and teach the farmers how to grow products so they could buy locally and still maintain the global branding standards. Which, he must have had incredible insight into a changing world.
Right.
It's not too long ago that Mao Zedong starved to death 40 million people.
Yeah.
So, the idea of America and the idea of Western culture was such a golden ring, a golden apple, However deceived they were by the reality of what that means and what capitalism is and does to cultures, they embraced it and they ran with it, and it completely transformed that part of the world.
Right.
I mean,
go ahead.
In 1986, I moved to Taiwan to go to high school, and the country was still under martial law. Chiang Kai-shek's mother was still alive, or his wife was still alive, and his grandson was running the country and stuff.
Right.
You couldn't get any products from anywhere. There was no Coca-Cola. There was the Taiwan beer and tobacco monopoly, so you could get one kind of cigarette, and you can get one kind of beer.
Right.
And you go back there now, and it's literally that shopping mall culture that you were just talking about taking over Kentucky. It's a global phenomenon.
See, that's fascinating to me. I mean, the capitalism has done culturally a very interesting thing in that if you look at traditional cultures, there's a lot of value to them, but there's a lot of boredom too, and not much innovation. If you painted, a Julian Schnabel and tried to exhibit it in India in 1840, people might not even be able to see it as art at that point.
It would have had to have been run by the government.
Yeah.
I mean, up until very recently, in places like Singapore, which is one of the most progressive, westernized Asian countries in the entire region, every exhibition had to be approved by the government. If you had anything controversial at all, anything anti-government, anything political, no show. I mean, you can't now. That doesn't happen anymore. In the last 10 years, it's really changed a lot. But even in places like Myanmar or Burma, you can't, to this day, you can't make a painting that includes a color that's representative of the opposition party to the government. You'll be arrested for it.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that.
That still exists.
Wow. I didn't know that at all. I knew, well, to reflect on that then, I mean, you still have elements of restrictiveness that I think capitalism culturally can mitigate. And I like that. I actually like that about the system. There's a dynamism to it that traditional economies and traditional societies don't have. And there's an inherent, I think, it's not only destructiveness but self-destructiveness. It's a cancerous system as well. It eats human experience, and it eats environments, and it eats social relations and personal relations and so forth.
Right. It'll lift the living standard of the individual, but at what cost?
Yeah, it's a deal with the devil in many ways. But I don't necessarily advocate a return to traditional. That's why I like talking with someone like you, because you have these experiences. And you're not simply advocating something reactionary, a return to something previous. And in the exhibits you had in the lodge, I saw a lot that was, to me, kind of, I hate to say straddling, because it sounds like that also throws us back, but let's say straddling a more traditional approach to making art and something more contemporary in an innovative sense, if that makes sense.
Well, I always was a big fan of immersive experiences. I like to take the exhibitions and sort of maybe elevate them to a more interactive experience.
Right.
If what most people's experience with art is through the internet and looking at Instagram and all that sort of thing, when they do take the time to come to a physical space, I wanted it to be sort of a transcendent experience, Right. I always like to think of the lodge and galleries in general as temples to secular awe, Most,
yeah.
The only other time you feel that way is usually through a religious experience, or the birth of a child, or something, that like lifts you out of yourself and makes you feel connected to something greater. And the only thing that does that that's not connected to something controversial is art. You stand in front of a painting, you go to a gallery, and you see a show, and it all comes together, and you feel something greater than yourself.
Right.
I definitely think that through art and through a tangible gallery experience, you can feel those sorts of feelings and then avoid all the trappings and tropes of the politics of things like religion and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was a big motivating force for me.
No, I like that. Are you acquainted with the writings of Georges Bataille?
Vaguely.
that one of my own inspirations.
Probably from you.
Yes, that could be for better or worse. But one of my own inspirations through Bataille is exactly it sounds like where you're headed with that. I don't want to be a religious person, even though I was raised with that, and I still wrestle with the residue psychically of coming from a religious fundamentalist type social environment. But I have feelings that and approaches to the world that would be considered extremely mystical, and so Bataille. But traditionally, mysticism is an experience of God and of the sacred, and I can slice those off and look at an atheistic mysticism. And Bataille, when he was in the south of France during World War II, began writing what he called a Summa Theologica, an answer to Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, a mystical exploration in 3 volumes, but without God and without religion. And with this idea of the erotic and art and our awareness of death all intertwined together. It's fascinating. I don't even know if it's successful or what successful would mean in that. But I see art as being one of the only places you can go other than the woods or a mountain or the ocean and really meet that greater experience, consciousness, whatever we want. We don't seem to have words for that. But, as we're evolving into something else, maybe some sort of global network, I hate that word, but some sort of global community of creative people versus this other force, which is not only environmentally destructive, but experientially dead, of the mall world. I think we need things like the secular ecstasy you're talking about, or atheistic mysticism. The words fail me in that sense because we're using words that are borrowed from previous approaches, previous ideologies, and this is a new thing. I mean, obviously, we're talking about that, but it's a very new type of world emerging if we can confront some of the iron boots that are squashing us, like climate change, and move through that. Then I think there's something really potentially amazing we could get to.
Well, it's interesting to me. I've always been drawn to, any kind of experience that helps cultivate and grow consciousness. I've been fascinated with what consciousness is. It's one of the primary motivating ideas behind a lot of what I do. When I was very young, I grew up in a world where I was surrounded by people of all religions, and I suppose somewhere in my head, I very early on decided that all of them were wrong, but all of them were right too, because I think inherently inside all of us there is this drive to want to understand our connection and what's going on and all the empirical questions, Right. And if you look at all of the major religions of the world, the one great expression that they all have is the arts. They use the arts to do that, and I don't see, with what we know about the world now and what we understand about how religion can have its upsides and downsides, embracing this idea of secular awe and receiving those feelings, engaging the questions of morality and consciousness and purpose without getting bogged down by the politics of it all, and feeling that experience standing in front of a piece of architecture or going into a gallery and feeling that experience by connecting with a piece of artwork or making a piece of artwork, or even, making, there's all sorts of fun, like abstract, bizarre, like creative, non-purposeful websites out there,
Right.
The poetry of being a coder and stuff like that. All this is in the secular world using the same sort of traditional ideas that religion has always taught. But I don't know, secular awe is sort of a phrase that has always stuck with me as I go through that.
Yeah, I understand that. Like I said, to me it's akin to atheistic mysticism, and it tells me that we're after something that we haven't attained, or we're not. It's I should say, because I don't know what attainment of that would be, but there's a clarity that usually comes, like you look at a relationship 3 years in, and you understand a little more about the dynamics between you and someone you, I should say. But with this, we're so new to it, we haven't even shaken hands. And so, once we can greet this other world that is potentially there, a few years in, we can describe this with new words instead of secular awe or atheistic mysticism. The new museum. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, it goes back to what I was saying before about how, sometimes you just have to wait for time to pass so that people of the future can reflect back on what happened and give it a name and give it a context.
Right. And the purpose of me talking to people and writing about this is hopefully to ensure that there are people in the future, that they're not wiped out by, mind-boggling income inequality and devastating climate change.
Well, I don't know if you saw that thing on the Internet, speaking of the Internet, where there's these predictions that climate change will wipe out the human race by 2050. Yeah. Not quite the uplifting morning news that you want to hear when you get out of bed, but
no,
I'm not sure if it's that drastic, but certainly there's the fear of it, and that's real.
I think that the problem is that the possibility of it being that drastic is a live hypothesis. It's real in that sense, and in talking with people and talking with the people in my own head, even if you have that kind of danger, an existential threat of that magnitude, especially, that should be taken seriously. I saw a cartoon once where this is related, but there's a one panel, and a man is standing up, and he says, I like these ideas. He said, but what if we shift our economy to something healthy and sustainable and very humane, and we just do it for nothing? He's angry at the fact that we might actually be positive, progressive people, and it turns out like climate change isn't as horrible as it sounds. And I think there are a lot of potential responses to, as I've been doing more research, that we're not investigating, and we're not investigating them because there's no profit in them.
I was going to say, it's the downside of capitalism is that, resolving a lot of the issues that people would like to solve means that less profitability for the company. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is the best example I can think of. If there was a cure for cancer, then they wouldn't be able to sell all the drugs that they deal to, people who have cancer.
Right.
My mother has Parkinson's disease. She suffers through that. She suffers through the enormous expense of all of the medications required to keep her mobile and alive. If they solved the problem of Parkinson's disease, those companies wouldn't be making a profit. So what is their interest in supporting any kind of progressive solution to the problem?
Yeah, and the fact that you can say that, not just you, but we can all say that, is evil. It points to an underlying evil that is utilizing human suffering for its.
But isn't it so much a part of human nature to do something like that? I mean, look at the history of human beings. It's certainly not the most evil thing that we've ever done, but it's right up there with all of the other horrible things that human beings have done to each other forever.
But we have had other ways of behaving. If you look at Jonas Salk and polio,
oh yeah,
he thought that that the cure for polio was so great, you can't bogart a medical find. And we, a fellow years ago, as I was talking with him about scholastic philosophy, even we were discussing actually the history of philosophy, and I made some notes and I said, you could pair off sets of themes which constantly repeat. And he was arguing with me about actually the existence of God. And he said, if the mind has these repeating forms that we keep encountering, there's an eternality to it, at least within a bracketed form of, human experience, a collective human experience, that you could say is eternal. And with that, the ownership of an idea would be rendered moot. So if you're discovering something that's going to benefit people, that discovery came from a reservoir of ideas that you don't own. You have no claim to whatsoever. So to say I actually can reduce some particular cancer or eliminate it means you just hit upon something the same way that if we were all camping and we needed water, and I walked and I found a creek, and I said, the creek's flowing, it looks safe, I tested or whatever, and let's all drink. I couldn't just find the creek and claim that that's mine, and then charge you all to come to it, since I had no responsibility personally in finding the creek. So if you discover,
well, isn't that what the U.S. government did to the Native American population of this country?
Yeah, the U.S. government. I mean, as I've said before, I have a very black pill understanding of U.S. history at this point. I really would like to see it broken up and changed into something more humane. Its history is very dark, and even the promises that are contained in some of the written words of the founding fathers, to me, are empty and blood-soaked. So I would like to see, I do think that the U.S. government does that all the time. Corporations do that all the time. And capitalism, that's one of its inherent functions, is to claim the commons, to claim human experience and farmland and water, even, and air and climate and a planet as its own, and excrete them once it's done. So, but what are you working on right now? You're talking about immersive experiences.
Well, I'm working towards a new gallery that'll probably have a lot to do with those kind of immersive experiences. But in the meantime, I'm really working with artists to try and help promote the ones that I think are the most progressive, and trying to find new ways and new solutions to how to work in the art world.
Right.
I'm a big fan of anyone who's willing to take a chance at a time, especially when it's difficult to take a chance, because it's getting harder and harder as the art world gets more inundated with more artists and fewer collectors and less champions out there. So I'm sort of building towards a new project that'll embrace a lot of those things, and doing a lot of writing as well. Soon enough, I'll have a finished product that sort of takes you on like a little history of my experience moving through the art world, and sort of my reactions to some of the changes that are going on and predictions about what might possibly come to fruition there. But
no, I'm very,
it's an exciting time. For me right now, it's a very percolating time, a gestating time. I'm going out there. When I worked in the gallery, I was sort of stuck there for 6 days a week for almost 6 years. So it's a chance for me to get out and go visit studios and go see new projects. And it's kind of an interesting opportunity for me right now.
Yeah, when can we see some of what you're writing, do you think? Do you have any sort of time frame to that? Because I'm fascinated in talking with you here and then talking with you at the gallery and things. You're one of the people, I think, that is actually wrestling with what the future of art and the future of art as a practice. And that ties in so much with other themes that I want to discuss with you about, art, being an artist as a subject, as a political, economic subject, and how we get away from, the demand for money, really, and having to rely on that.
Absolutely. I would have thought, if I'd gone back 30 years ago to when I first moved to New York, I would have thought that in 30 years I would have some sort of specific clarity about all of it. But I think I'm just as confused as everybody else.
Right.
And I suppose sometime in the fall I'll start leaking out like sections and things like that through my website, which I think you mentioned before, New York Art Consultant. It's somewhat of a general blasé name for a website, but there are all sorts of exciting things going on there. And sometime towards the fall, I'll probably start releasing all of that stuff.
I really look forward to that, and if we can have you on again to kind of pick up where we're just about to stop here, and that is, in this idea of the future of art, because I'm thinking of some of the same things you are along that line, and I have some projects that I guess I'll call them puppets, but they're really more immersive, presentational performance things, and I feel better about that than I do about paintings, in a way, because the galleries are getting so, they're almost like holy places you have to go to by invitation, find the time, when people are really experiencing art through, like you said, Instagram.
Well, there's just so much more to talk about, Terry. Like, just what is the purpose of a gallery in a world where there's such a backlash against the way that they're operating, you know? Right. The consolidation of the mega galleries and things like that, and the lack of opportunity on one hand, but then this rise of the creative entrepreneur on the other side, and like it's just the beginning, and where will that go? And artificial intelligence and AI and virtual reality and all of that influencing the art world. There is an excitement for what's to come, and maybe this feeling that we all have of this lack of culture, this diminishing of culture, is an opportunity for a counterculture to that to emerge in the future that'll make it all clear.
No, I totally agree, and I think that it's anytime you deprive people of a necessary thing, whether it's a basic thing like food, sleep, water, or aesthetic experiences and insolence, which I think most of us have at least a need for that spiritually. Yeah. You produce a tremendous backlash. And I've got some guests coming up that I think lead onto that, because the younger people, especially the 9-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, the 11-year-olds, they're not accepting any of this. My daughter the other day, she's 17, I was talking with her, and she seemed really down at some moment in the conversation. I said, "What's on your mind?" And she said, "Just what you said. We're done by 2050. That's heartbreaking. And as, a guy...
Don't you think it's funny that, analog guys like us living in a digital world are more optimistic than the people who were born into the digital world?
Yes, or maybe we're deluded. I don't know.
That's entirely possible.
Yeah, I'm wrestling with that. But, Jason, thank you so much for taking time to be with us and just talk this morning. Let me say this again. This is The Other Future. My guest this week is Jason Patrick Voegele. You can find out more about him at the website New York Art Consultant. That's NY Art Consultant, all one word, .com. And hopefully he'll be back. It was really good talking with you, Jason.
Terry, thank you so much. It's always such a great time talking with you, and I look forward to more in the future.
Exactly. All right, man. You have a good day, and thank you.
Take care, brother. Bye-bye.